Welcome again to the public keynote of the Winter School of the University of Vienna's research platform, Governance of Digital Practices. And before I give the floor to our dear guest, Noopur Raval, I would like to make a brief introduction. So Noopur, welcome. You are an interdisciplinary researcher interested in understanding global futures of work, the life and all the work decisions made by immigrant workers in tech companies, the changing values, the moral norms, and projects of personhood, especially in post-colonial settings. I read from your CV that your background is in media studies, cultural studies, post-colonial history, cultural anthropology, and critical information studies, and you received your PhD in informatics from the University of California, Irvine. Your dissertation, which looks really interesting, I just had a look at it, platform living, theorizing life, work and ethical enactments in the gig economy. There you take an ethnographic approach to work, consumption, and life experience within gig platforms. And I think this is also a lot of your empirical work that you might also draw upon in your talk today. Right now, you are a postdoctoral researcher at University of California, Santa Cruz, but soon you will be joining the Department of Information Studies at UCLA as an assistant professor. And before that, you had a lot of, how do you say, positions or states where you have been. You were at the RE Now Institute at the New York University and also had several fellowships such as Berkeley and Berkman Klein Center at Harvard, and so on and so forth. In your work and research cooperations, you are interested in affective and corporeal dimensions of digital participation, as well as play and pleasure, as well as marginality as a space of life and knowledge making. And you are interrogating how technological participation changes gendered norms, class and caste hierarchies, and social life in urban spaces, especially outside of the US and Western Europe. Your talk has the title, "The Algorithm is a Convenient Lie, Rethinking Expertise and Invisibility to Support Decolonial Digital Practice." And I guess you will discuss with us how we deal with the diversity of labor and related practices that make today's automation and machine learning possible. So the floor is yours. Welcome, Noopur.
Thank you. Yeah, that was a great introduction, and I'm so glad to be here, talk to all of you. It's a big audience, and I apologize if there are parts of my talk that you've heard elsewhere before. It's very possible. But I hope that we can have a great discussion afterwards. Just to give you a bit of an outline of, I guess, what I'm trying to do, because I really took the mandate of the virtual winter school, or rather the emphasis on the school part of it, very seriously. So I started to think to myself that, you know, this is an opportunity to almost engage with people who are trying to learn something and to commune with people who are also trying to teach in different institutions, maybe. So it is a very personal talk in that sense. You know, there's not much of information giving, but more thinking through some of the topics with all of you all. I will start out with, of course, giving some examples from my empirical research, just to help you understand or ground us in where or how I arrive at insights and conclusions and things like that. And then I kind of switch gears to thinking about, you know, what do we mean by decolonial digital practice? What do I mean by it? How do I interpret that for my own pedagogy and scholarly work? And then maybe give some examples or maybe some approaches to what seems both like a desirable paradigm and a desirable approach, you know, decolonize everything, but at the same time seems like a sort of an impossible task, right? So with that, I'll get started. As Katya described to all of you, my empirical work, my ethnographic work in my dissertation, especially kind of focused on looking at gig work platforms, especially in urban India. And I think one of the issues that I want to bring up from some of the examples in the dissertation work that I'll discuss with you in a minute, the themes that I want to focus on, especially today, is kind of this binary of obfuscation and providing explanations. I also feel like this is a good bridge between platform studies as well as, the newer sort of critical AI studies work. And one of the questions that has been on my mind moving into the AI stuff, especially during my time at the AI Now Institute, was, what is the validity or what is the utility of experiential accounts within large algorithmic systems, big data and algorithm powered systems, right? How do we make sense of individual narratives, feelings, experiences, and knowledge? And when it comes to countering or investigating or interrogating, what it is that platforms are doing to us, for example. And that's why I've kind of, the other thing I'm trying to do with the winter school mandate is also to try and give you almost like a list of readings or references that have been very formative to my thinking and writing, because, I think, again, the myth of individual authorship or ideas is also a convenient lie. And in some ways we'll come to it later, but I think to decolonize also means to think about our citation practices and whatnot. So in that spirit, I've just kind of cited, or, I'll go along and give you some people's names or books or whatever that have been very crucial to the argument that I'm presenting today. So with that background, I feel like everybody by now, probably in the audience, kind of knows the larger story around gig work platforms and gig companies like Uber and Lyft and Ola and Deliveroo and DoorDash and what have you. The simple explanation for anyone who may not be aware is that these are app-based services that have now proliferated globally. And they offer us the possibility of ordering a taxi ride or food or sometimes on-demand care services, right? So babysitting services or beauty and healthcare kind of services as well, mostly often either in the comfort of our homes or, in the case like in other people's cars or in taxis or whatever. But the big disruption technologically that they've introduced is the ability to match demand and supply in real time using various kinds of algorithms and an algorithmic assemblage, as well as big data, right? Scholars have since also pointed out a range of issues that these platform companies have raised for all of us, for governments, for regulation, but also for just ordinary citizens and people figuring out how to behave with each other and how to live in a society in some ways where thinking about the morality, as well as thinking about fairness and justice of how to compensate laborers or workers for the work that they provide. These companies have raised very important questions and in some ways a crisis for thinking through those questions as collectives. With that example and with that kind of background, again, out of our way, the example that I want to share, again, keeping in mind my first claim, which is the algorithm is a convenient lie, is to kind of offer you an example from gig platforms in India. But before that, I also want to kind of draw the loop or connect the loop with what Katya said earlier, which is about always having to situate technologies in their socio-historical, political, and material contexts. And I think that's kind of where my dissertation work and where my thinking was going when I was studying these platforms. As she also described, I'm a media and cultural studies and anthropology and so on and so forth scholar. And so I've always learned the lesson from my mentors that focusing exclusively on technological objects can sort of skew our understandings of them, right? They can produce this myth and illusion and vision of novelty And especially in the context of gig work platforms, the word that was always being thrown around was disruption, right? That these services have disrupted things. They have disrupted existing social relations. They have disrupted ways of doing things that used to exist before these apps and platforms came into the picture. And so when I started to move away or when I started to use the app itself and the transactions and interactions within the apps as a kind of lens to then look at the city itself and to look at how social, political, economic life is changing by removing the focus on necessarily what the app is doing, I felt like it revealed a host of different things, which I'm going to talk to you about today briefly. So the one example that I want to give is, again, the case of dynamic surge pricing, which is an algorithmic mechanism that is kind of very crucial to the success of gig work delivery platforms, right? What does it mean? Just in case you don't know, you see how ordering an Uber ride from point A to point B can often generate different kinds of pricing, right? So you don't always get charged the same amount, depending on the time of the day or depending on if there's a traffic jam or a big event in between or other kinds of factors. One of the other factors that also influences surge pricing is actually events of crisis, right? So, and there are some very interesting examples of this from Australia as well as from New York City, where there were two separate instances of quote unquote terror attack or some kind of gun firing episode. And the police was responding to it. But what it meant was that in both of these cases, people were trying to flee away from those zones, right? And find the quickest transport to get away from those places. And so they started ordering Uber and Lyft. And they saw that, there was surge pricing in effect. So because the Uber algorithm Uber algorithms had detected that, there's extreme spike in demand in a particular place, as the system normally operates, it started to charge people 3x or 5x the amount to be able to book a car ride. Now, as you can imagine, this caught the attention of a lot of regulatory authorities because this is absolutely unacceptable to actually make money off of people trying to flee a crisis zone. But these are more extreme examples. But I think what they do reveal for the discussion that we're having today is the fact that as soon as the discussion got to, well, why is there surge pricing and what exactly happened in this case, the companies never really seemed to resist the claim by regulators, which was to say, you need to fix your algorithm. You need to fix whatever algorithmic technique and logic is at play. And you need to build in different kinds of exceptions to make sure that you're never going to do this again. That if your algorithm or if your system, let's say, is able to detect or needs to be able to detect that something exceptional is going on in a place, and hence you need to suspend surge pricing or find ways to control it. What happened in India, which is a less extreme example, is that the city where I was studying this phenomena, which is Bangalore, the Silicon Valley of India, the techno-innovation hub, et cetera, where tech companies and startups have an easier time bending the rules and have an easier time sort of getting some sympathy, empathy, and understanding for, things that could go wrong in technological systems, let's say. The city government and then the state government started getting consumer complaints about how surge pricing was really exploitative and was charging people extreme amounts to get from point A to point B in the city. And as the city government officials started to hear about this, in a sort of very well-meaning way, they decided to cap or limit surge pricing to just 1x or 1.5x, not in exceptional situations, but in all situations. So they put out these guidelines and said that this is the blanket rule. Under no circumstances should these new, confusing, mythical, mysterious companies that have just come about to be, in no circumstances should they be charging customers more than 1x of the price that the base price that they would compute. And I was there, I was mostly focusing on workers' issues. But what was interesting and how I came to get interested in this particular example was because my outlook till then had mostly been on looking at workers' situations and workers' demands. And I was quite confused as to why a lot of local authorities, regulators, and so on, nobody seemed to be really interested in talking about, what workers are facing or how we need to regulate these companies actually from the perspective of workers' rights. And then it took them a very, very little time to quickly respond to consumer demands and consumer complaints. And then they put this in perspective. So I took this information and actually went back to the public policy person at Uber at the time and had a discussion. I wanted to know what is going on. It was a really interesting discussion because we were bringing up issues of fair work and fair wages for work. And the policy person, of course, had this interesting script or the thing that they're supposed to represent. And they brought up the fact that they said, it's not really the company's fault. We develop a set of technical instruments and we have ifs and thens and conditions for how we are supposed to be making a profit in this business model. And so according to that, everything would have been fine if we were allowed to use surge pricing. Anyway, but the thing that they ended up blaming the most in that conversation was very interesting to me because they said, if you have a problem with surge pricing or if you want the workers to get paid better under the new set of rules, then why don't you go back to the government and make them focus on the fact that there is a certain metric, for example, that in Bangalore, the average speed at which a car moves is maybe like 5 or 7 kilometers because of the traffic jams, right? So they had this set of sophisticated metrics for how the city moves as a mobility assemblage. Then they had another set of metrics about road space allocation. How many taxis are supposed to be moving on the road as opposed to how many buses. And the representative for Uber kind of arrived at this interesting conclusion at the end of it, which is to say that in this set of circumstances, the algorithm can really not do anything, right? We cannot as a company do anything technological that would support the workers because we're not even to blame. It is the fact that the government is interested in protecting consumers more than workers. It is the fact that there is so much rain in Bangalore in many, many months, like across the year. It is the fact that the roads are terrible. It is the fact that the public infrastructure has not caught up with the times and with the population, which in fact makes us a critical, essential service in the city. And so if we need to make money or if we need to break even at this point, this is the only way to move forward. And I think that's kind of one of those instances that stayed with me, where I first started thinking about how this word, right, the invocation of the algorithm is used by different kinds of actors, often representing corporate real-world applications of AI or platforms, but at the same time used by regulators and used by a set of other actors to get at something, to point to the black boxedness or the unknowability of technological systems. But in contrast, or rather, actually, let me pause for a second. So I forgot about this episode, or I've written about it and I moved on. But I was recently doing a different kind of digital school with a bunch of feminist activists who all felt and thought that, rightly so, that they need to update some of their understandings of how digital technologies and what emerging technologies are out there and what kind of problems they may face when it comes to thinking about feminist activism and advocacy. And again, one of those things that everyone seemed to want to know about, was very curious about, but they really didn't know who to ask. Was this thing the algorithm? And so we spent some time looking at, the same kind of information that I'm sharing with you, which is this is how platforms like Uber and Ola work. And if we really wanted to make them fair, we would have to address a host of different issues, which as computer scientists often call garbage in and garbage out. And that if we manage to address this entire socio-material, urban, infrastructural, political landscape, maybe we would arrive at ways to make some technology like this more fair. And at that point, one of the people in the class kind of pointed and said, but what if we could just peek in? What if we could just see what is happening in there? Like, isn't there a way for us to, get these engineers and have them give us an explanation of why a certain earning was computed, or, why certain ratings affected workers in a certain way or whatever, right? Which is in itself a different field right now of sort of accountability, explainability, algorithmic decision-making, and obfuscation in algorithmic systems, and how do we arrive at clearer explanations or transparency when dealing with these systems. I want to state right off the bat that I don't think that they're wrong approaches or inadequate approaches. I think that in addressing some of these issues, we're going to need a plurality of approaches. So my interest as a scholar and what I'm talking to you about today is not necessarily to say that those slightly perhaps even more positivist or empiricist approaches to figuring out like where do we go from here, there's no need for those, or they're useless. But I think what I found myself gravitating towards is that, and this is where I cite or use work by Paul Durish and Jenna Burrell, because I think they early on raised this issue, which was to say that explanations or even investigating algorithms and interrogating them is not necessarily a straightforward or easy task, which I imagine that this audience, having gone through all the lectures and conversations, kind of already understands. And so that's kind of also what I was trying to explain to the feminist advocacy group, which was that even if we could peek into how dynamic search pricing works, it wouldn't be so simple to come up with an understanding or explanation for what is going on. But more importantly, and I think this is a point we all should probably take with us, is that in the new regimes that we live, which are constantly shaped by the politics of databases, interacting with algorithms, and then further interacting with deep learning and unsupervised machine learning, and so on and so forth, the key factor remains is that they refuse to provide us any sense of consistency. They refuse to provide us truth because they don't give us the fact that is hidden behind all these systems, right? It is the fact that these regimes, the interaction of a database or looking at databases as an information form tells you that there are multiple thousands of ways of assembling information in different ways and utilizing that information not to articulate facts or give factual information, but in fact to articulate predictions and offer possibilities of what could happen, of which we could pick any, is what makes it trickier to get at the truth of the algorithm or of an algorithmic system. So another instance, which I think I'm going to actually skip over because I want to get to another project, but another instance of the same thing, right, of trying to unpack the algorithm and figure out what is going on within platform studies that I discovered was something that gig workers would often call Uber math. So they would call the fact that these systems are producing opaque decisions that they could not make sense of, and that they have been keeping, what you can see on the right, these personal account books, and that their personal accounts of what should be was never matching what the app dashboard was showing them. Was again this exercise in like figuring out like how do we understand what algorithms are doing to us? And to go back to my initial point about Diana Butcher's work, for example, was to do with the fact that what do we do with experiential accounts? We all have these accounts of something I saw on my Facebook feed, or, the way Instagram curates information for me or serves me media. What does this mean? And the fact that I develop feelings, or, I feel a certain way, especially when it concerns depression or concerns mental health, and how platforms can get us into these really toxic loops. And then, there was this big revelation, I don't know if you followed this, where there was a leak about Facebook's decision making around how do we regulate content that people are seeing on Instagram, and especially teenagers, right? And they said, well, there's not really an easy answer for it, first of all, but also that we've thought about it, and that we're curating it, and so on and so forth. So we kind of get lost in explanations around what may be happening, what we are experiencing, and how to go forward about it. And that's why I decided to kind of start focusing on the enchantment of algorithms, or what focusing on the algorithm or algorithms in a particular context does in terms of obfuscating or hiding the other factors at play that might be leading us to the kinds of realities that we inhabit right now. This example is kind of related to what I just told you about, which was, again, an instance of trying to get at the truth of what algorithms are doing. And this is this wonderful paper. I highly encourage everyone to go read it, by my friends Vidushi and Shivangi, who kind of, again, went in with this outlook of like the New Delhi is the capital of India. New Delhi police was deploying a predictive policing system. It wasn't quite clear what is going to happen using this predictive policing system, or what kind of algorithms are involved in predicting crime rates and so on and so forth. But they had some of these things that we've all heard, right? Which is the hotspot maps and hotspot mapping, and figuring out where crime could happen, and so on and so forth. I won't try to summarize their paper, but the reason why I mention this is because what the paper finds at the end is that it was so much less about focusing on the statistical techniques, or even the processing of data through those techniques, and how they were flawed, which is a great approach to get at something, absolutely. But in this particular case, it was actually more about understanding the conditions in which policing data is produced, right? It was more about understanding the communities and networks that are involved in managing police accounts on a daily basis in a police station. Who gets to, who gets put on a register versus who does not get put on a register. How the police come to understanding and also reducing their own work by resolving certain kinds of disputes, and not classifying them as instances of crime or instances of surveillance, and so on and so forth, was the main story there. Why this was really interesting to me was because I thought, okay, just as an experiment, like, I should also go and try to talk to the police in another state where I lived, and see what they're doing in terms of the technological exercises. And the first thing that they all told me was that, yes, we have heard about this New Delhi police deploying the predictive policing system. And what you should understand, so they were speaking very candidly, and they said, what you should understand is that a lot of the push for adopting new and experimental technologies, at least in India, is top down. So it comes from, the national government as well as the state governments, literal technological imaginations and imaginations of what our future should look like. And so there's so much adherence, and there's so much desire to produce an aesthetical sense of technological participation and technological modernity, which I find to be the more interesting story than the fact that, say perhaps like in the case of the US, where there are these fully formed, really, really sophisticated technological systems that are doing, extremely insidious things to their citizens. So what the police told me was that when they received the mandate to install a predictive policing thing, the first thing they had to deal with was vendors. And they knew that all these vendors actually wanted to sell them a system that would create a kind of dependency where once they build the system, the police department would have to keep contracting them for maintenance and to keep the system running. And if, should they choose to not use the system afterwards, then they would, receive punishment, or they would not be seen in a good light by their higher up officials. And should they continue to use the system, then they would have to rely on these vendors and keep talking to them every time there was a glitch that could cause, serious consequences for people who get caught up in the policing system, as you can imagine. So they said one of the easy ways that they came to a diplomatic sort of consensus was that the higher up officials wanted them to use a face recognition technology and use the existing criminal database in order to match both and see if somebody that, I think I'm getting a bit of feedback. Okay, I don't know. Anyway, so what they did was they caught a bunch of criminals or potential criminals that they had done through their traditional methods, people that they were going to hold in a cell for a few days while they investigate the case. And in order to please their higher ups and officials, they paraded these individuals in front of one of the CCTV cameras, which was very close to the police station. Because their issue was that the images that they were getting from from the images collected out in the wild was that these images were just not good enough to give them any sorts of reliable results. I find it both funny, but also kind of a check or a reminder of how the less glamorous story of all these different material factors, as well as the production of information itself, kind of affects the eventual outcomes, and focusing too much on the shiny objects and the machine learning and the algorithms can often sort of lead us to believing or understanding that everything is dystopic, of course, and that there's no solutions, but that also that these systems work in sort of fully formed ways. Oh, no worries. Katya, how much time do I have?
You have 20 more minutes easy.
Okay, great. So then let's jump to the next project that I want to talk to you about, which is the project that I did at New York University, which is called a New AI Lexicon. And please, please, please do click on the link and check it out. It's a set of 45 plus curated essays written by journalists, scholars, advocates, all kinds of people, mostly from the majority of the world, mostly from non-US and non-Western Europe contexts. And without really telling you everything about the project, I'd love to tell you why I thought that we should do this project. So again, coming out of the understandings and the things that I had learned that I just described to you, which is that we need to focus on the environmental factors, we need to focus on the politics of information databases, we need to focus on the relationships between different kinds of human actors that are all equally crucial to the functioning or malfunctioning or the functioning of technological systems only to serve certain communities and not others. If we want to focus on all of these factors, as much as we're providing answers to how AI works, we also need to start populating and creating an agenda for the questions that we have about AI systems working or not working or being deployed and developed across the world, right? We need to have a good understanding of the demands that people are making from technological systems, from their specific communities, from their specific advocacy projects, and so on and so forth from different parts of the world. One suspicion that I had in that was that when we would actually do this exercise, we would end up collecting writing and thinking that would perhaps almost detach itself from technological questions. And I thought that that would probably be the most exciting thing to happen, because it would reveal to us these these less easy or less obvious connections between political projects and social projects, as well as a longer history of a place that eventually manifests in technology development and technology development for convening modern futures. Oops. No. Okay, so I'll just give you 3 examples of essays that really stayed with me. All the essays have been on my mind, and I've been trying to find ways to unpack the project now that we've done it. So these are not the best or the only ones at all or anything like that, but I just find them, I use different examples for different talks to think with the project. And so one of the big revelations of doing such an exercise was to realize that in non-Western, non-Anglo contexts, there isn't necessarily readily available terms to describe what AI means, right? And that means it's both terrifying and exciting because it means that it demands interpretation, translation, and meaning making around specific kinds of AI technologies, be it facial recognition, be it voice recognition, so on and so forth. And so the first essay that I've put here by Aswata Babu narrates this one instance of when facial recognition technology vendors are trying to sell the face recognition technology to 2 different sets of people. One is the police and the other is school in Chennai, I think, in India, in South India. And what happens is because there isn't already an understanding of what exactly they mean, what exactly the technologies do, it invites these sort of functionalist definitions and translations of AI. And in this case, as the term says there, it literally translates to face identity technology. There's a much longer history of the politics of facial recognition and identity in India, and especially some very grave consequences that biometric identification has had on people's basic human rights. I think some of you might be aware of it, which is related to Aadhaar, the big biometric identification project. But also there are newer technologies coming in that are coming in parallel to the state's anxieties to determine who gets to be a citizen and who doesn't get to be a citizen. And if that question was resolved for a very long time or was not brought up, AI and facial recognition and the things called AI are allowing various communities and various political actors to raise the question or to reproduce these anxieties by means of producing new and unreliable forms of forensic evidence. So what does it mean when you're able to show a link of criminality or potential criminality by using a faulty technology or an experimental technology? And what does that mean when the state and the police treat that as official information, as something that they can take decisions based on, which then suddenly re-questions your belonging to your country or your ability to avail of basic public service. The second one talks about the larger global political economy of AI development. And this is another issue that we got a lot of essays around from the Swana region, or what some might also call Middle East, but it's the Southwest Asia and also North Africa, where there is obviously a lot of political attention in terms of what's happening. But what's interesting is that these governments are also really, really eager to adopt AI technology. And we got the opportunity to invite some people to write who've all in fact questioned how development or how justice in this case, or terms that are actually used by a set of conflicting actors get weaponized when talking about the goals of AI for good or AI for development. And the last one that I want to quickly sort of point to, algolinguicism, is written by Mashinka Hakopian, who talks about the case of Armenia, but also generally points to what happens when things like AI for good get tied up to geopolitical imaginations of which places should be served and which communities should be served. And this is an ongoing dialogue between corporations and governments for the most part, but also nonprofits to some extent. So what happens at the end is that when we use terms like global south or AI for development, they end up in some ways including consumers and citizens who live in parts of Africa, parts of Latin America, and parts of Asia. But they kind of end up often leaving out parts of, for example, Eastern Europe, but also other parts, a lot of islands in the Pacific, a lot of different countries that just don't figure in this conversation. And corporations are also more than happy to forget that people live here, that communities have political stakes here, because they don't constitute lucrative markets that these companies can use or have any interest in. So the question was really, what gets left out in the conversation of developing inclusive technologies when it comes to AI? All right, now switching gears very quickly, I felt I had some sleeplessness around how to address the charge of decolonizing or decolonial digital practice. And again, I think, it's a term that everybody uses. It's a term that we've all also been told not to use as a metaphor, but it's kind of hard to not decolonize everything, right? If you are not familiar with, this amazing essay by Tuck and Yang, which talks about how to not decolonize or what decolonization is not, it's not a metaphor, is a really good starter on the topic. But what I'm going to do today is switch gears from giving you more information to actually talking to you about my pedagogical practice and how I've tried to cut through this fog of like decolonization is everywhere, but decolonization means nothing. Because I think then the only way to move forward, as my friend and mentor Nishant Shah would say, is to kind of develop your personal stakes and define what it means to you. So I've tried to do that in my work, maybe in 3 different ways. And the first one that I want to talk to you about, especially when it comes to decolonizing AI or decolonizing AI studies, refers to, I think, shifting the ground on what kind of intellectual histories we draw from, right? I don't want you to read all of my work always at all. I'm just putting it out there because this is where I managed to collect my thoughts and write about it. And again, the impulse that it came from was that a lot of people were saying, we need to include humanities and social science scholars in conversations on labor rights, on technology, and so on and so forth, but also AI, as if the insertion of a humanist or a social scientist is in itself going to do something to this technological production, to reform it, or even maybe decolonize it. Just include an indigenous scholar in the production of a certain technology, or include an African-American scholar and the technology. At least nobody can blame us any longer for a racist technology, for example, right? Which is obviously not true. But then what would it take to de-link, using the words of Samir Amin, or sort of unanchor from what we know as, or what we treat as, the kind of epistemic and ontological ground based on which we arrive at our questions. So I found some very interesting literature, also a big distinction, right? So I was finding it kind of impossible to take a lot of questions on critical AI and how to study AI. I couldn't really port them over to my context, which is India, because the key distinction is that a lot of critical AI scholarship, especially coming from North America, is in some ways responding to or drawing on debates in settler colonialism, right? So it has a different kind of trajectory of what colonialism means and how to undo it. However, coming from post-colony, or a place where the colonizers left, but all our important institutions, including the language and medium of instruction and education, our bureaucracy, our entire information infrastructures that help Indian people make sense of each other, are still very much, as well as the law, are all embedded in colonial British practices and legacy and so on and so forth. How does one decolonize? Do you just move away? Do you just stop using English, or do you just stop, doing a whole bunch? Do you just not participate in technology? Because these are all serious attempts that people have done in the past. But I don't think that is the way to go. So I started looking for ways to find the intersection of technology and colonialism in the subcontinent. And I found some very interesting scholarship. Unfortunately, I can't talk about it today, but if you're looking as to what to do in your context, which, if you are also facing the same question of like, the questions available to you are not necessarily working for your context, I highly recommend kind of doing that exercise. So the Chandok Sengupta book that you see on the screen, for example, talks about how the history of fingerprinting technology actually comes from colonization, colonial encounters in India. The paper that you see below by Projit Bihari Mukherjee, talks about the blood group B and its intertwining, as well as he has a larger body of work on the specific inventions in eugenics that get intertwined with colonial rule in the Indian subcontinent. And so I found them really interesting to approach questions of AI in my context. Engaging with a lot of this scholarship, I think still did not and does not solve the problem that I think a lot of us face, and people even conflate an issue, right? Which is that as soon as we're asked to decolonize something or approach a decolonial outlook, our instinct is to dig out historical literature or sort of refer to the meta God texts of non-white, non-European literature and say, well, engage with that and I've decolonized things, right? And that didn't work for me, but I don't think that is also what we're supposed to be doing. Because when I was teaching in classrooms in the US, giving my students this information about, fingerprinting or serology or those kinds of examples wasn't necessarily always ringing a bell with them, right? Because they come from such diverse multicultural backgrounds, often not from the US. And so as a teacher, it was always challenging to figure out like, well, how do I still communicate my argument and how do I still convince them of the agenda and the program for decolonizing as a value or as a principle, while keeping an eye to their plurality, the plurality of their interests and lived experiences and so on and so forth. And this kind of actually ties in, I'll wind up in 5 minutes. I think I'm over time, but this ties in with the work that I'm doing right now and the work that kind of came out of my platform studies scholarship as well, is that I think we need to challenge the modes of inscription and the modes of thinking about social problems. So whenever asked how I would decolonize something or where I would go to find alternate modes of knowledge production, my own training and lived experiences have never inspired me to really go back to a sort of long history of colonization. I think as a post-colonial Indian, living post-economic liberalization, living under the effects of globalization, the sources or the places I've gone to look for answers and make connections has often been a more recent history of a political economy of underdevelopment and development that happened much later after experiences of colonization and independence. That starting there often helps me and my students understand, why does currency exchange work the way it does? Why is global labor distributed unevenly the way it is? Or why do people get paid differently? People like Amazon's Mechanical Turk workers or other kinds of digital workers, why do they get paid differently? So that has definitely helped. And the other thing that had always irritated and annoyed me was that since I was writing about my context, a place where I had grown up, which is India, I was never really interested, even in platform studies, in representing the condition and the fate of my people to the West or to the outside academia, right? I was more interested in understanding that now that we see platform studies or platforms emerge as a reality, where are post-colonies going from here? And in my head, the understanding is always that why do we need to pay attention to post-colonial life is because the majority of the world lives and works over there. So they in some ways give you directions for, regulating or affecting people in a much broader sense than they would in the West in many ways. Anyway, so I wrote this paper that is inspired by the works that I've put on the screen, which does at least two things. It critiques the impulse. So this might actually be, I guess, the sort of counter argument to what you guys have been discussing until now in the winter school, which is that I question why we need to constantly look for the invisibilized workers behind the screens, hidden behind somewhere, in order to find ways to forge global solidarities amongst workers. I'm very intrigued by why a racialized form of empathy for the other, for the Black and brown technologized other, that becomes so central to the imagination as well as the actions that more affluent consumers of technology take in North America, in Western Europe, but also in India, where the people, who consume from the platforms. Why does empathy become such a central sort of hinging element in that? And the other paper that I want to flag, again, when thinking about decolonizing, is my friend Ranjit Singh's work. He works at Data and Society, where he again takes up literature around, data colonialism, right, which became so useful and so important to understand global data regimes being assembled. Maybe I'll put it that way. But a lot of people have also asked what data colonialism really means, or whether it is the correct interpretation. And Ranjit points out or reminds us again of the fact that it is less about the evilness and ideological consistency of corporations as the new kinds of colonizers who are going out there and, assembling these armies of subaltern workers hidden behind the screens who are doing your dirty work. But if you really look at it from the perspective or situated in global South contexts and lived experiences, we often find we're able to attend to the ongoing contestations between different communities and actors in those settings that are equally central to the stories that we tell about global internets or global technologies. And if we really want to decolonize, digital practice or thinking and teaching, we have to find some way to decenter the hegemonic centers, and decenter this kind of empathy and empathetic subject, and instead find ways to equally platform and insert into the canon the stories and histories of people everywhere in the world. So with that, I think I want to end. And maybe these are like more actionable ways to move forward, which is to really resist the extractivist impulse within our fields. And I think, computer science and adjacent fields really need to think about this. And as far as pedagogy is concerned, something I've been asking myself is how do we creatively stage historical engagements and encounters in technology studies pedagogy, where we don't default to just telling people about, who built the early internet or who was chatting on early online forums, but we situate them in the context of where those people were participating or where the internet was being made or distributed or maintained. And finally, how do we decolonize the present and do so in the places that we are, instead of, running to a kind of canon of decolonizing readings or studies or whatever it is? How do we develop local stakes so that we can actually make a difference? So my answers to that, like I said, is to fight a recanonization, be it of any kind of literature, queer literature, critical feminist, critical race studies literature, whatever it is, paying attention to the politics of language, And most importantly, I think integrating care, responsibility, and accountability in scholarly practice, which I think is getting harder, especially when it comes to AI, critical AI studies and technology studies more broadly, because we're always facing the new technology and we're always trying to react and respond to it. So I think I'll end there.